Why did you choose to focus on makeover shows for your book?
Well, it's interesting because I'm trained as a 19th century literary scholar, but when I started my job at Indiana University, they needed me to teach a class in gender, sex, and pop culture. And so I started looking around to see what was happening in contemporary American culture and what did I want to document in the class. And that's the year that Queer Eye for the Straight Guy started, What Not to Wear had been out for a couple of years by then, Extreme Makeover started then, and so I saw this whole proliferation of makeover-themed programming coming on television, and I decided to build that into my class, and it ended up being so interesting talking with the students about it that I wanted to write an article, and the article proliferated and grew and turned into a book. But it was really one particular moment that captured my imagination, and I actually start the book with this moment. There was a woman on Extreme Makeover named Amy, and she said at the end of all of this elaborate plastic surgery, "I'm so grateful that this has happened, because what this means now is I don't have to pay attention or listen or obey what anyone tells me to do again." And I thought, that is really such an interesting idea, that somehow capitulating to these ideas about what a body should look like allowed her, in her own expectation at least, to transcend those expectations. And I thought, in many ways, that doesn't make any sense, that you don't get more power by giving away all of your power. And instead of thinking about Amy's statement as completely incoherent and illogical, I wanted to figure out, is there a way that would actually be a statement of truth? And so the whole book is really trying to figure out that statement, because it really is true that you end up having more cultural power, largely through these derivatives of your appearance and this notion of self-confidence that sort of percolates through the makeover narratives.
So as you were writing your book, did you discover a particular theme in the shows that you were looking at?
Yeah, I actually, when I first conceptualized the book, I had planned to mostly stick with the ways in which the shows represented the female body. So I was really interested in plastic surgery shows, in particular, like Extreme Makeover, Dr. 90210. There was one called Miami Slice for a little bit, The Swan, a lot of plastic surgery before and after. And then it became really difficult to sort of only stop there, because there are a lot of sort of quasi plastic surgery shows where they're doing microdermabrasion and laser eye surgery, and so like 10 years younger. There's just a lot in that regard. And then I began to see the way that there were these patterns between all sorts of transformation shows. So whether I was watching Pimp My Ride, where they're making over an old car, or I'm watching Extreme Makeover Home Edition, where they're like completely knocking down a house and bringing it back up again. All of these different kinds of transformation themed shows were kind of situating this symbolic body that a person's identity was sort of coded as synonymous with that body. So if I'm on The Dog Whisperer and my dog is acting up, that I'm having a crisis of identity and I need this expert to come in and help me renovate my unruly dog, or my unruly child on Super Nanny, or my unruly finances on Maxed Out, or my unruly closets on What Not to Wear, or Tim Gunn's Guide to Style. And through the intervention of this sort of superior style being, it would help release the inner me. And so I became really attentive to the way that all of these shows, regardless of which symbolic body they were working with, were dealing with this idiom of identity, that somehow there was a flawed or fractured or pathological inner me that needed the device of the makeover in order to release it. And even now that I'm in the after stage of the before and after with the book, I find it fascinating that all of us apparently have this sort of idealized, beautiful inner self. There's no sense that you release the inner self and it's a sort of Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde moment, and that it was a bad thing to let that inner self out. It's a very Augustinian kind of argument in some ways. So these are really old narratives. They have long-term appeal. We've sort of been debating these things for a long time. But I think the fact of reality TV's proliferation, a switch to digital production, being in a moment of privatization where we are being encouraged to turn our direction back onto ourselves and to cultivate the self as a form of product that helps us compete in a global marketplace, I think all of these things are conspiring together to make this a very specific historical time where there's a proliferation of these shows that ask us to be constantly worried about the location and the health of the self, and somehow actively involved in its better maintenance and bringing it out, releasing the inner me.
So can you talk a little bit about the makeover culture in general, or specifically like the controversy surrounding Susan Boyle and Sarah Palin and the broad spectrum of plastic surgeries?
Sure.
And things?
Yeah. In the book, I primarily talk about television in relation to the broader makeover culture. But one of the things that's amazing to me is the way that it sort of percolates into this cultural consciousness, these flashpoints that are happening all the time. So when Susan Boyle wins the Britain's Pop, or she kind of made it to the next round, everyone was saying, see, we aren't a kind of vain and horrible people because we had these expectations about the way she looked, and her talent won out, and then of course she capitulates, she goes through the makeover, but she's not conventionally beautiful. Doesn't that mean that we are better than this sort of media saturated culture suggests that we are? And I think what was interesting about that actually was some sense that her appearance was so coded to notions of authenticity. It was actually the opposite of what we see in television makeover discourses, that somehow we could believe her more because she wasn't beautiful in a conventional way. Whereas the TV makeovers tend to argue that if your appearance is blocking how people are reading you, if there's a disconnect between your outside and your inside, that it's incumbent upon you to change the outside so that there isn't this sort of lack of intelligibility between the people out there and who you really are. You often hear people say, I need a facelift because I look angry or I look tired. And that's not who I am inside. And so I need to go through this so that the inner me will be seen. But you see the same argument in reverse. I'm depressed and sad inside, and so I need the outside of me change so that it will trickle into the inside. I think when people like Susan Boyle sort of erupt into our consciousness, basically what that's doing is just amplifying the degree to which these positions, inside, outside, self in relation to inside, outside, and the appearance in relation to all of these things work together. And with Sarah Palin, one of the things I thought was so fascinating was the way in which it, spending $150,000 of donated funds on high-end clothing from high-end retailers was somehow seen as an imperative for her gender, that this was the expectation on women who were in the public eye. And again, I think it reinforced this notion that in a 21st century culture where there are cameras on us all the time, like one's on me now, that we really have a higher obligation to invest in those things that will make us more telegenic, that make us more palatable within this larger culture of the image. And in some ways, I'm completely critical of that, and in others, I'm completely sympathetic to it. And in the book, I try to blend both of those impulses in me, to read it critically, but to also celebrate what's going on. Because at the end of the day, the reason that I've watched 2,000 hours of Makeover TV is because I love the happy endings.